Kia ora koutou, ni haku mihi ki koutou. Whakatakata hau ki te ura. Kia ora, Rob. Mōnana. Whakatakata hau ki te ura, whakatakata hau ki te tonga. Ki mā kina ki uta, ki mā taratara ki tā. Ihi aki ana te atakura, he tio, he hoka, he au, hei, te hei, mauri ora.
Great, thank you very much for that. So again, welcome to day 3 of the hearing of submissions on Dunedin's draft future development strategy. And just before we hear from our first submitter from the officers, anything you wish to draw to our attention at this stage?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd just like to ask the panel for some clarification on the information that was requested yesterday. So particularly in relation to vehicle counts in Mosgiel, we've discussed this briefly with our transport person, and some information can be collected relatively easily. Some will take some time, some we can't provide at all. Vehicle counts on the State Highway on Gordon Road are relatively easy to obtain from Wakakatahi's portal. Information on vehicle counts on other roads such as Riccarton Road and Dukes Road would require some modelling, which will take some time. It's not going to be possible to provide origin and destination data or data on the kind of freight that the vehicles are moving. So particularly in terms of the modelling that would be required to determine vehicle counts on Riccarton and Dukes Road, I just want to confirm that that's something the panel definitely needs and wants in order to make decisions on the submissions for the FDS before the transport team undertake that work. That's work that they were expecting to undertake as part of the Mosgiel feasibility study, which is programmed in the FDS anyway. Yeah. Thanks.
All right, so Councillor O'Malley, I think that was your request. Do you think...
Councillor Noon.
Yeah, I just wonder, is that information crucial to us considering what wording changes to the FDS we might recommend?
I was more interested in the trends, and but if we've got the information with regards to Gordon Road, that's pretty valuable because that's essentially where the focus is and the concern is. So I'm comfortable with that and accepting that it's likely to lead to a feasibility study at a later date, which will be more detailed and collect the information on those other routes. So I'm satisfied. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think we were agreeing there'll be a continuum of information based on the level of request. So what they can provide for us, as described, I think, is what I kind of expected. So I'd be happy with that.
So just to clarify, just the Gordon Road data then? Yep, lovely. Thank you.
Could I just ask a question on that? If you get the Gordon Road data, say there's 100 truck movements, we know there's 250 or something, but say 100, and the assumption is that if there was a heavy bypass, 50, 25, 50 or 75% would change to the other route. The question that they should be able to say is, does there need to be a lot of work on Riccarton Road or Dukes Road at those quantums, though, surely? And that may be helpful in guiding. I don't want to get the definitive feasibility, but I think there's some assumptions you can make about what investment or the capability of the existing roads, whether they can take that any more traffic on that. I'm just wondering if that's going to at least get us down that pathway.
Yeah, well, that's a bigger question. That's not just the provision of information, that's an analysis, which I think might be better undertaken at a later date, unless, Emma, you have a different view. Okay. Yeah, so at this stage we're just asking primarily staff to provide us with information to help our assessment of the submissions and our consideration of whether we would need to recommend any wording amendments to the draft FDS. All right, so thanks very much for that. So now our first submitter is Dunedin Tracks Network Trust. Good morning and a welcome to you both. Perhaps you can introduce yourselves, and then, but before you do that, just to let you know, we've read the submission that you lodged, so you don't need to reread that out to us, but of course you're very welcome, and we look forward to you highlighting key points for our information.
Thank you very much. I'm Paul Coffey. I'm the chair of the trust, and it's coming up a year, I think, I've been the chair for.
I'm Sarah Davey-Neatis, also a trustee of the Dunedin Tracks Network Trust.
So what we do want to do initially is acknowledge all the research, all the listening, all the time, the robust discussion, and that's the compromise that has been made to get to the writing stage of this. So we want to thank the politicians, the policy analysts, the communications people, the administrators who not only just provide the venue and make sure everyone's fed and watered, but do an inordinate amount of work in the background. So we just want to thank everyone for all the work to get us to this stage.
So again, just a brief introduction to who we are, the Tracks Network Trust. We didn't really do that in our submission, but many of you have seen us around and heard us speak on numerous occasions. So just for those that don't know, we are a trust set up in 2020 with the vision to Ōtepoti Dunedin, the hub of Otago's trail network. We've recently developed our strategic plan, 2024. We've got an MOU, DCC and DO, Department of Conservation, which we understand is with the CE of Dunedin City Council ready to be signed, so that's excellent. We're proposing 5 trails to be key trails to the Dunedin City Network, and we're really driven to achieve these trails. We've undertaken 2 feasibility reports, and there's been the second community fundraising event is tomorrow to raise funds for the build of these trails. So we're making slowly but surely good progress.
Oh, sorry, could you just push your button down again?
Future development strategy document, again an excellent document. The key themes throughout the document are that well-being and access to the outdoor spaces, the attractive connected neighbourhoods, the biodiversity, healthy natural environments, active transport, zero carbon, resilient communities and a thriving economy. It's evident from the Mayor's forward, from the ORC Chair's forward, throughout the objectives and throughout the strategies. Our vision of the Trust directly aligns with the vision of the future development strategy, and we believe that trails have a very prominent place in contributing to the achievement of this vision.
We do believe that during that consultation, we do believe that during the pre and consultation phase, we have been heard, and that is reflected in many of the 12 strategic directions. So we, again, thank everyone for that contribution. We do have some key things we want to happen. We do see that the Tunnels Trail, which is connecting Dunedin to Mosgiel, is critical for what we want to do. It's not part of our program, but it is critical for what we would like to see, which is a connection right through to Central Otago and eventually right up through the Alps and Ocean. We also want to see the coastal community cycle connection happen along that coast, and there will be a speaker speaking to you about that in a few minutes' time. And then a link from Tairi to Waihola. The trail's already to Waihola and it is being used. There's a defined ground trail on that ground trail there now. You can see where people have been cycling regularly, and Dunedin is missing out. We need those tourists to come into our city to spend the money in our city. We also want to see that during the work that's going to be done on flood protection, that we're included in that, and that there's an opportunity for the use of those flood and stop banks to be used for cycling in shared pathways.
The other aspect, specifically in the and key points in there that we just want to highlight, that the development strategy ensures accessibility for all people, and that considerations given to linking the commuting trails urban to recreational trails, which are more likely to be in the peripheries. The likes of the Greenbelt connection is an excellent concept, and as it considered to be multi-use. That's undertaking a review at the moment. There's the need to consider supporting infrastructure, specifically the storytelling aspects of the trails, the wayfinding, the signage, and then of course the toilets and the rubbish bins. So that's just as far as enhancing that recreational experience for residents and visitors alike. And then what we'd like to support you in, and what we think is important in the future development strategies, the likes of these collaborative programs where you're incorporating trail builds with predator control or native plantings. So we're bringing a number of processes or concepts together and collaboratively moving forward.
Oh, goodness, sorry. We want to be on board, and as a charitable trust, we have the opportunity to seek funding that local government is not able to get to, and so we'd be very keen to support with that. We know that we've been heard so far, and when the implementation plan for these are put in place, we want to be there as well. We see that there are partnerships, both urban, rural, and back to the urban. We want to work in that biodiversity area, not maybe doing some of the planting. We're not expertise in that area. There are other groups that we would work with to support that, and as we said, the storytelling as well.
Just reminding you of those 5 trails. And finally, just a thank you, and are there any questions?
No, thank you for that presentation. That was very clear. I'll see if we have questions for you.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Hey, thank you for the presentation, Sarah and Paul. With a focus on 6.3.3, or 6.3 in general, around the importance of flood infrastructure, whether it's an operational, management or capital improvements, you're looking for a greater emphasis on active transport and connectivity. So are you able to share with us the sort of language you would like added into that strategic direction, just to help strengthen at a high level where you would like to go?
There you go, then I'll go.
I think the likes of dual use is where it's providing its core purpose of flood protection, and that is the core purpose. But in developing that structure, cycleways are enabled.
And I'm sure the chairman's probably going to ask you to be, may give you some homework, but I'll let him do that. But I think the key from ORC's perspective is we want, we don't want to be an impediment to the growth in this area. So yeah, we're looking for a way forward, put it that way.
Where we'd see it sitting is in that the wording would be around that the tops of the stop banks would allow for recreational use where appropriate. That's sort of the wording we'd be looking at.
Thank you. Apart from what Andrew's just mentioned, so overall you're really happy with the direction of the FDS and the wording, so there's nothing specifically, as I said, apart from what we've just talked about, that you're really asking for a change. You're just supporting what's written and asking to be involved in the implementation plan.
Correct.
And yesterday we heard from the Tunnels Trail Trust, and they were saying that they believe that that's the number one priority, and you're of the same view, that of all the trails, that's the number one priority, which is obviously included in the plan.
We see that as being the number one priority for specifically DCC investment. We can be working alongside and in parallel to that development. We'll be looking at different funding sources, and so yeah, totally, it's number one. The Taieri Trail needs to link to the Tunnels Trail, and it does provide an awesome opportunity for that link between urban and rural.
Thank you.
They're also much further along in the development. It's been 18 years that Gerald Highland has sat in front of people and asked for this to happen. You know, and I know we're newcomers and some of our partners won't be that happy, but the reality is, you know, it's ready to go. It just needs to happen.
Paul, Sarah, thanks for your presentation. It just made me think about some work that I'm doing at the moment on the TPLM, or Te Pūtangi Ladies Mile variation in Queenstown, where we're looking at dealing with stormwater coming off Slope Hill and those types of things, and considering 1 in 100-year events, which won't be flooded that often, as potentially opportunities for corridors that would use cycleways and shared pathways, because we expect if there's a 1 in 100-year event going on, no one's going to be out cycling probably on those types of days. And when I was looking at your presentation here on the stormwater pathways, you were on the top of the stop banks. Is there anything to say that they couldn't be lower down if those provisions were available, or is there a particular reason? I'm really just thinking from the shared use perspective and setbacks and reserves where they might be multi-use.
We've looked specifically on the Taieri, and along the Silver Stream it makes sense to go above the stop bank. We did look at going down lower in the Taieri. Just the structure of the trail needs adapted, and need to work with the ORC as to what their engineers are happy with, essentially. But concrete was investigated as far as if you go down into that channel, and then you need to consider the 100-year floods are happening every 5 years these days. So I think it's very area specific. You need to look at the flows and and work out what is going to be your best option for building that, because I think, again, moving forward into maintenance, you don't want that track to be wiped out regularly either. So yeah.
One other consideration when I was have been thinking about that, mainly because I live at the end of the peninsula and it does blow on the peninsula, and we have a fantastic shared pathway there at the moment. And you see a lot of people struggling when the wind's not favouring the direction they're going in. And if you were lower below those stop banks out on the Taieri and places on those types of days, certainly it would be easier. Is that part of your consideration, or is it solely about resilience of the infrastructure?
It would be part of our consideration, but basically cycling, no matter which way you go, there's a headwind. It's just a fact of cycling. It's, you know, so we have nothing set in stone. We will work with organisations to what is set in stone is we want these trails in place, but otherwise where they are and how they're built is we're malleable in those situations.
Thanks for the presentation. Noting that Emily Cooper's presenting next from the cycleways on the north coast, how does the TRACS network determine internally basically its priorities? I mean, I can see Chain Hills Tunnels is quite a way further ahead and was actually sitting in a funding line there for a while. How do you order your priorities?
We've got 2 trails progressing forward at this stage, the Taieri Trail and the Coastal Connection Cycleway. And the Coastal Connection Cycleway is broken down into 5 sections and the Taieri's into 3. And so the Taieri group is working at their pace, developing stage 1, section 1 of the Taieri Trail. And Coastal Community it's pretty much led by the community groups and where they're going. Emily, as you'll find out, a priority is section 1 out there, Wakawaiti to Karatani, but community drive and progress is also happening in section 5, so we're going with that. So it's where opportunity lies, and then from a trust perspective, we're coordinating approaches to funders, philanthropic trusts and the likes, saying this is where we see we're going to spend $1 million, another 2 million over the next 5 years, and so we've kind of got that coordinated approach to those funders.
Thank you. Don't want to go anywhere where I shouldn't be because it's like conflicts, but I just want to ask a question that's really coming out of other submissions we've had, and that's from the accessibility groups. And just understanding what... Do you think that the trails that you are supporting or are focusing on will, and look, Paul, I appreciate you've been involved in the sector much longer than I have, are you targeting something that would be accessible both by width and design and grade? Is that something you're putting in here? But we've been challenged to say, look at universal design, and I want to understand where you're sitting with that.
We would have all of that in our trails. The only difficulty would be, and they are trails, so they won't be pathed. So your standard wheelchair with a small wheel at the front and skinny wheels, there will be issues about travelling on that. But in a normal power chair or a slightly adapted chair, you can use these trails. Gradients are the rail trail standard, so yes, they will be accessible. There may be in some areas, some people may require some form of barrier, but we would make sure that you can get through that in some way. Usually the cattle stop type thing is the thing that's appropriate.
So I'm an independent hearings commissioner based in Napier in the Hawke's Bay, and I'm also a keen cyclist, so I don't think that's a conflict, but never mind. So in Hawke's Bay, the Hawke's Bay Regional Council has been very proactive in building shared paths on the top of their stop banks. I think just about every stop bank in the Heritonga Plains has a shared path on top of it. A lot of them got munted in Cyclone Gabrielle, but they're now being restored, and they're very popular, and they just comprise packed limestone, and that seems to work fine. And in terms of the stop banks being maintained by machinery and mowers and things, they seem to the shared trails seem to cope with that quite well. So certainly familiar with the concept that you're promoting. But what I'd like you to do, because it's our job to consider and recommend to the council's specific wording changes, so I'd like you to identify the exact location in the draft FPS with reference to either section number or page number and paragraph numbers, and tell us what wording you would like to see inserted to further that concept that has been discussed regarding the use of the stop banks. And just for your information, in terms of some of the issues you raised, the staff have recommended to us some amendments. And so in terms of the Coastal Connection project, which currently sits in table 24 of the FDS, and at the moment the time frame is unconfirmed, and the staff have recommended to us that we could consider inserting the 10 to 30 year time frame into that. The FDS only has 3 time frames in its time frame column: 1 to 3, 3 to 10, and then 10 to 30. So they're recommending that a time frame be inserted, which currently there isn't one. And also we circulated some questions to the officers prior to this hearing in writing. They've answered those in writing. And so they've also provided some wording for us to consider for table 20 of the FDS regarding the St Clair to Portobello track, and they've recommended to us some wording we can consider that says investigate developing a track from St Clair along the eastern coast of the Otago Peninsula to Portobello, and again that would have a 10 to 30 year time frame. So I think that was in response to your submission. So just to let you know that you've already indicated you're happy with what the draft FDS has in it, but there have been some enhancements recommended to us by the officers in response to your submission and the submission of others. So just wanted to make sure you're aware of that. Great.
Thank you very much for that.
Great. And the homework I've asked you to do to be of any use to us, that would need to be with our hearing administrator by the end of Monday. So we look forward to receiving that, and other than that, thanks very much for coming in and presenting to us and answering our questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next submitter is Coastal Community Cycle Connection. So good morning and welcome. You may have heard me say to the previous submitters that we've read everything that's pre-circulated. So yes, we've read your submission you lodged. You don't need to reread that out to us, but you're very welcome to highlight key points for our attention, and then we'll see if we have questions for you.
Kia ora koutou. I'm Emily Cooper from the Coastal Communities Cycle Connection Group. We are a 575 member strong group with a vision to connect the Dunedin communities of Waikato Karatane and Warrington Waiteri with shared use pathways, and to connect these communities to the central city. Today I'd like to comment on the Office's recommendation report on submissions to the FDS. We are pleased to have this project included in Table 24 of the draft FDS. However, I note in the recommendation report for transport infrastructure for the North Coast that despite multiple submissions from the community, it is not recommended that the Coastal Community Cycle Connection is indicated as a short to medium term project due to challenges there may be in gaining adequate funding for this project. Is it not possible to leave the options open? I urge the committee to consider how the requested support for this project may also provide just what we need to get us over the line. This project has made huge progress already and will not cost the councils themselves significantly if we can attract Waka Kotahi funding for the sections providing an alternative for State Highway 1 pedestrian use. The budget put out in our feasibility study was $21 million for the full 35 kilometres of pathway. Almost 70% of that is for the section from Evansdale to Waiteri, which will require Waka Kotahi funding. But this could be 100%. That leaves only $6.7 million for the rest. I understand that the DCC and the ORC are required to prepare the FDS in time to inform their long-term plans and the infrastructure strategies, and to inform budgeting decisions in those documents and the Regional Land Transport Plan. So in the draft mid-term review of the RLTP, the DCC has stated that to support active transport, Dunedin City is investing in a cycleway project between Caversham and Mosgiel and working with community groups to facilitate their investigations into walking and cycling connection in the north, servicing the communities of Warrington, Karatane and Waikato. The DCC has included the Northern Cycleway in the Transport Plan submitted to the 2024 RLTP for future NLTP budget post-2027 to connect northern coastal communities to each other and to Dunedin with a walking and cycling trail. We also anticipate that the cycleway will be included in the DCC's walking and cycling strategy due for release shortly. Regarding the officer's comment that as this is a tourism network rather than a commuter network, co-funding from different sources would need to be explored, as Waka Kotahi only co-funds commuter networks. Regarding this comment, I would counter that the purpose of the network is in the name, Coastal Communities Cycle Connection. Aside from being a catchy example of alliteration, the name was chosen to communicate the drive behind the concept, connecting these communities to each other. The driver is not tourism. However, let's be realistic, it will be a huge attraction, as the commuter route along the harbour has proven to be. And how wonderful is that? To attract Waka Kotahi funding, let's emphasise the commuter aspect. If the government announces a tourism infrastructure fund, then we can pivot and fit into that mould too. Because, in truth, we are both. Do they need to be mutually exclusive? In summary, we have already received fantastic support from council staff and councillors from both ORC and DCC. We would appreciate the continued practical advocacy for our project, especially when it comes to funds not coming from council budgets. Thank you.
No, thank you. See if we have questions. Kate.
Thank you. Having ridden that Evansville to Waititi bit on the State Highway, I'm just interested what it would look differently about that. And again, I'm going to repeat the question you heard me ask about accessibility on that trail generally right round, how that would look as a universal design. If that's good.
The feasibility study is based around sort of, standard design practices. It's completely flat along there, and obviously it's really a cost issue. But with a boardwalk going in the estuary, which is what we're planning, then that could be fully accessible. So yeah, that I don't see that would be a problem.
Sorry, the part I was talking about around the Blueskin Bay is also understanding how does that differ now from a wide width beside the State Highway, where what does your trail look like on that flat bit of the road, or is it all in the boardwalk now? I'm just wondering what the design looks like, and it's probably getting into detail more than future design, but how significantly different it is from the current experience.
So the current experience, if you want to cycle from Evansdale to Waititi, is you're taking your life into your hands. So there's no room, basically, for a cyclist or a pedestrian. So what we're proposing for the entire trail actually is off-road. So the idea is that you're not cycling or walking next to vehicles. So it's all about safety. So it would look completely different to the current experience. And I guess just loosely we're planning it wouldn't be beside the road. It would actually be like a boardwalk situation in the estuary. Yeah.
I too was actually surprised to see in that staff response that it was being referred to as a tourism network, given that. So I've just got to declare I'm on the Waikato Coast Community Board as the attached councillor to that board, and then on the Regional Transport Committee, and obviously with my role in infrastructure, sitting over transport. Our advice, I thought at the time to you, was that it would be put forward as a commuter network connecting those towns, and then the bits that needed to connect the other parts could be considered more under the tourism banner. So I'm just raising that I was surprised that was the answer, that it was not a commuter network. Because if it is, you'll get different opportunities for funding, mostly through, and you'll get the safety and the accessibility funding buckets. Is that your take on what you thought it was too when you started?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Like I said, I think commuting into Dunedin doesn't necessarily have to be the focus. You can also commute between your local communities. But yeah, definitely commuting being the focus rather than tourism. That was my understanding, and that's the way, as I understand it, that we can attract Waka Kotahi funding for those significant pieces which is the whole drive for the project, which is Evansdale to Waititi and also Waikawaiti to Karatane as well, because that's also a very treacherous piece of state highway.
I cut you off, sorry.
Sorry, would never take your children along. You'd certainly never take a the accessibility issues are, and safety issues are. It's a real problem.
To building resilient communities, which is one of the objectives. The recommendation is that it's indicated as a long-term time frame of 10 to 30 years. Given where you are at the moment, do you think is that an appropriate one, or would the medium one be nearer to the more appropriate?
Definitely, yeah. Short to medium would be more appropriate for sure. The long term is just. I mean, we'd probably have other bits done, and then the other bits, the bits along State Highway 1 would just be sort of languishing. So it seems like it would be a real missed opportunity, especially if it's not actually going to be costing the council themselves anything.
Just starting by declaring my interest as Deputy Chair of the Otago Peninsula Community Board, and have been throughout the whole of the Otago Peninsula Connections project. And when we initiated that project, it was about linking the communities. So appreciate how you started that, but throughout that process, we were wanting to link Broad Bay with Portobello, Broad Bay with Mac Bay, and then Mac Bay through to the city. To enable us to achieve funding, we were quite happy for that to no longer be called a community safety project, because really we were looking at children being able to walk to the different schools and undertake different activities. We became accepting of it becoming a shared pathway to achieve the Whakakotahi funding that was available. And different than Jim sitting beside me, I wasn't surprised to see the council calling it a tourist network, because that's really what we had to name it to get the funding to have it in place. And it achieved the outcomes we originally wanted, but no one can probably remember that because of where the funding eventually came from. So I'm just thinking from the perspective of what your trust is wanting to achieve to link those communities to the north of us, what is the type of wording you would like to see in there from council with regard to the FDS that reflects the fact that it is a shared pathway, it will have tourist aspirations, and primarily it is for enabling safer commuting between the communities, and appreciated the fact that it didn't have to link to Dunedin to be able to provide that. And it may be that, I know what the Chair will say after this, he'll say, get it to us by next week, and so I'll give you a little bit of time to think about that. It's not a question I expect to be answered right now.
I guess what I'm trying to say is that we want it to happen. We don't really care what it's called. And I guess what I'm asking is, and you know, can the staff please help us out with perhaps what, you know best about these processes, and the staff have been amazing over the last sort of 3 years that it's been so far. So I guess I'd like your recommendation and expertise, taking into account experiences from the Peninsula Connection and also the harbour shared pathway as well. We want it to happen, and I feel that the OSC and the DCC also share that vision. So how can we work together to make sure that we make this project happen, and what should the wording be? Yeah.
No, understood.
And I think following on from Jim and Hawani, I mean, would it be helpful to put it in stages? Because obviously some stages are going to be done hopefully more quickly, and I don't know whether that's more helpful, whether in table 24 or in the wording in the document. I don't know whether that would help, because obviously, that's just a thought.
Yeah, possibly, yeah, splitting out the ones that are along State Highway 1 could help, yeah.
So like Commissioner Hawani, I was thinking about some wording as well, because at the moment in table 24 it just says cycleway, and just listening to the discussion, I was wondering if some wording along the lines of shared commuter and tourism cycleway, so you can have your feet in all the buckets. Would that fit the bill in terms of what your concerns might be?
Yeah, I think that would, yeah, sounds like it would fit the bill. And I think just touching on that time frame, you know, right now we've got the opportunity with the new bridge going in over the Waikaiti River, the new rail bridge, and we've got the opportunity to do a clip-on for pedestrian use onto that. So, you know, if we wait of 10 years, you know, I don't know, that opportunity may pass us by. Yeah, so, but look, yeah, shared commuter and cycling pathway, yeah.
Shared commuter and tourism.
And tourism pathway, sorry. Yeah, I think that would work.
And I think Councillor O'Malley clarified with you that you thought this could be a medium-term project in terms of our options. That would mean a 1 to 10 year time frame in terms of what will go into the last column of 24 that I understand you're familiar with, because your submission indicates that you are. So that's where that would lead us. In terms of that staging issue that Councillor Lucas raised, if you're happy just to touch base with our staff, they'll be preparing an end of hearing report to us that they'll present next Wednesday afternoon. Mm-hmm. So just in terms of getting that wording right, the staging, it would be great if you could work with them so they can put forward some wording for us to consider next Wednesday afternoon. Whether that's in the narrative or in table 24, I imagine would be relaxed as long as it's recognised in there somewhere. Right, I think.
Okay, thank you. Yep, very happy to work with the staff.
Great, so I think that's the end of our questions, but thanks for coming in and answering our questions.
Thank you. Cheers.
Right, our next submitter is the West Harbour Community Board.
Mr. Chairman, just before Angela starts, could I just check, because these people may be interested in listening in, when you're asking for a report back from staff, is that the planning staff or are you expecting, and I'm just for clarity for everyone in the room?
It's a combined end of hearing report from the officers. It would be the same officers who contributed to the original recommendation report. So it'll be a joint Dunedin City ORC end of hearing report, and they'll draw on whatever technical staff they need to draw on to inform their opinions.
But the technical staff
to us.
Yeah, the technical staff won't necessarily be here. That's just checking.
They may or they may not be here. We'll leave that up to the officers to decide.
Yeah, no, that's good. Just want to thank you.
Right, so West Harbour Community Board, good morning and welcome. Thanks very much for coming in.
Thank you.
Not sure if you were here earlier on, but I'm saying this to all the submitters. Thank you for submitting your original submission, which we've read, so you don't need to read that out loud to us, but of course you're very welcome to highlight any key points that you want us to bear in mind when we're considering recommending changes to the draft FDS.
Okay, thank you. I have banged on about things like infrastructure, toilets particularly, in at the West Harbour, because of the fact that we have quite a different, what's the word? We have quite a different pressure on our infrastructure related to visiting cruise ships. And because of that, and the 250,000 people we get each summer coming through, that's an issue that, in terms of the long-term presentation, I suppose, of the West Harbour as the gateway to Dunedin, is important to us to have a small town, village, whatever you want to call it, that is the first thing that people see that actually provides them with the services that they need. A lot of people get off ships, wander around, particularly because the coffee's crap on all ships apparently, so they get off and they have coffee, but also for some weird reason the toilets at the cruise centre don't necessarily get used as much as they should. People get out onto the street and suddenly discover they want to go. So toilets are something that is part of our infrastructure that really needs to be considered as a priority. The other thing about that too is the fact that it's not just the tourists though, it's the locals, and now we have the cycle path. So you've also got a lot of people coming to port now who wouldn't often have come, because now it's easy access, you don't have to go on the road. So that's very important. It's obviously a safety issue now that people can cycle all the way from Dunedin to Port Chalmers, which and we support the fact that they would like to cycle further north as well. Emily has been to the board to keep us up to date with what's happening with her project as well, and we do support that as a project. So in terms of the infrastructure, we have the toilets, we have transport is a huge issue, and thank you to the Regional Council this last summer, because the buses have been a much better situation than previously. But that is something that is going to have to continue to improve, because the ships are going to keep coming. I don't know if Port Otago considers there's a point where they've come to capacity and they can't take any more, but they're getting bigger and there's more people coming through on those. Two pairs of glasses. It's the thing is that infrastructure is a huge issue to us, and the thing is with DCC, of course, our Main Street upgrade has been languishing in the annual plan for quite some time, and given how Dunedin is starting to look, it would be very nice if our Main Street also received the upgrade we've been asking for several years, because that is the first thing that people coming in off ships and people on cycles see of Port Chalmers, and it would be nice if we were at the same standard, so that carries through into town in terms of what people see. So that's something that we'll start to bang on about a bit more as well, I would think. In terms of Three Waters issues, I suppose actually if I go back to infrastructure in terms of roading, we were disappointed to see that Long Beach didn't have any priority in the FDS. It sits below sea level, and Orokonui, actually over at Osborne, the road actually gets covered in seawater quite regularly, and it's a problem, especially there's a small community over there, but they do need access to be able to get in and out. And this is one of the things that also happens with Aramoana Road, because we have had previous floods, I think it was 2015 or 17, where we went to evacuate Aramoana, but we couldn't because of the slip at Hamilton Bay. And the fact was that the road itself was being undermined by the harbour, and the water was whipping up, and it was making it incredibly difficult to get those people out, so in the end we couldn't. So low-lying roads, especially Aramoana, and the whole community of Long Beach, and I suppose Osborne, which is only a smaller community, are really a concern in terms of with Long Beach rising temperatures and stuff, and higher seas, they sit below sea level, and that's not a good look, especially when there's heavy rain, because they have a lot of pooling. And it wasn't mentioned. I think Long Beach. Because Long Beach is a natural hazard, really, in the sense that if you have huge seas, we had a tsunami, I doubt that would happen, but they would get washed away, and that would be a real problem. It's quite a big community now. A lot of people are actually wanting to live on the coast, and they're good little communities, but they actually deserve to be recognised as having problems as well, that actually are something that needs to be addressed. Now, in terms of Three Waters, we were a little bit concerned about the fact that there's some discussion about decommissioning our reservoirs and the treatment plant at Sawyers Bay. Port has been cut off in the past. The road has collapsed at Ravensbourne once. I came across it on the way to work, and the thing was that, you know, we couldn't get traffic through, and there's no detour unless you go the long way round to Waitati and come over Blueskin Road, and of course that road itself too is a problem, and it's a council road, but that's our only exit, I suppose, apart from the Upper Junction Road, which has also been out at some stage, for quite some time. So thing is that having water coming from town, from Mount Grand, is all very well, but the problem we have, of course, is that we need firefighting. We've got our own fire brigade, who are also first response, and they need a water supply. We need a water supply in the event that we're actually cut off from town. The road, state highway, we get, obviously Wakotahi support there, but when it's not available, which is possible, we'll also need to have our water supply available to us for firefighting, emergency, to provide water to the community, because if it's coming from town and there's a break in the pipe and they can't get it there, that's a real problem. We have retailers, we have schools, we have childcare centres, and all of those things actually need to be supported. But also there's the recreational value of places like Cedar Creek. Excuse me. People use them for recreation, and also up to Sawyers Bay as well. And so the dams, while they're there for a purpose, they're also enjoyed for other purposes as well. And that's, really important, and people would really value that as being something that continues to be available. All right, okay. Transport infrastructure, of course, is important, because we've got a lot of people that live out there that go to town, that work in town. Excuse me. We have people who commute, obviously, on the shared path now. We have people that commute by car. We have people commute to town for education. Excuse me. And having a reliable bus service is very important, because when I first moved down there, 1991 I think it was, there was no bus in the weekends, and people just had to hitch a ride, and that was quite regular. That's something that you did. We do now have weekend services, which is really good, and particularly given that you've got cruise ships coming in and people potentially want to use it. A lot of people like to use local buses. They don't want to pay huge amounts to catch a shuttle bus to town. I think it was $30 in some cases return US this season and last season to actually just get into Dunedin from port, which is like 15 minutes if that. Excuse me. So I think that's something that we need to consider, is that transport is, a big issue for us, because we also need to have transport for people who work in town. There's a lot of people, around Dunedin don't live in the centre of town. They actually commute from somewhere else, and so that's a really important point for us. We need to mitigate all our risks, and that includes things like roading, water, and housing too, in the sense that we have good access roads, we have good footpaths, we have quite a few people who drive around on mobility scooters. Seen them on the shared path, which is great, but some of the footpaths and stuff make it, excuse me, quite difficult. for them to do that. So for West Harbour at the moment, it's really infrastructure issues that need to be addressed and to be considered into the future. Because we're a port, we're the gateway to Dunedin, and as such we should be represented in the same way as Dunedin is, in terms of what people see when they get here, and how we appear to people coming in. I know when I used to be down there quite often with the volunteers, people used to say, "Oh, is this Dunedin?" No, it's Port Chalmers, it's a suburb. It's sort of like an independent town. And they used to go, "Oh, I thought we were going to Dunedin." Ooh. That's died out a bit now. People realise that they're coming into not Dunedin City up here. So I think we need to actually upgrade Port to the same standards so that it looks like Dunedin and it is part of Dunedin. And, the communities reflect that. So I think in terms of the future, our future is really about transport. It's about good infrastructure, and looking to supporting the future in terms of what Port Otago does, in terms of cruise ships coming in and the people that brings. They spend most of their money in town, not in port, but people are sort of divided in some ways about who wants them and who doesn't. So that's a debate that I think will go on forever, actually. There's always going to be somebody who doesn't want that. And there's a debate, of course, at the moment about how much they're contributing to air quality or the lack of. And I would hope that Port Otago and the Regional Council would consider that coal dining is an option for Port Otago eventually, so that people can actually come and plug their ship in and don't need to keep their generators running all day, every day that they're there. So that's sort of like a big overview in a small time. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll see if we have any questions for you.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Hey, thanks, Ange. A couple of questions. One is around the net. Oh, thanks, Jerry. That you referenced Long Beach. Just wanting to understand from the board's perspective, is it around, at a higher level, is it around adaptation or mitigation or a combination of both?
I think it's probably a combination of both, because you've got an existing housing there, and obviously people aren't going to suddenly lift all the houses up. And it's protecting what's already there as well as planning for the future, because I know in some cases the likes of Purukanui, building is not as easy now as it used to be, and it could be that places like Long Beach have a limit on how many properties can now being built, or the regulations that relate to that in terms of higher sea level. I mean, it's sort of like looking to the future in terms of people who might want to live there. Is it possible, or is it appropriate that they actually live there?
My other question relates to the Sawers Bay water reservoir that's fed by Cedar Creek. On cruise ship days, obviously, there's a considerable demand for drinking water. So obviously that's part of the service that Port Otago provide, DCC provide, actually, to the cruise ship companies. And I suppose my question is around the capacity of that particular dam. And I mean, you've referenced potentially the West Harbour districts being fed by Mount Grand, but just focusing on what's currently there in service, is the capacity of the existing Sawers Bay Dam adequate in light of the demand, particularly in and during the cruise ship season?
It's a good question, actually. I don't know if we're, at capacity. I know we're in water restrictions at the moment, but we're only in level 1. Cedar Creek is full at the moment, so people are going, why are we in level, in level 1? Because we've got a full reservoir. But the more ships that come, I guess, and for some weird reason, I suppose it's the quality of our water. Some ships like to take water on in port, and the port company buys it from the city and sells it. So the word's probably got round that our water is actually very nice, and there will be a point where the capacity's not there, I presume, if the number of ships and the size of the ships continues to increase.
Thank you. And just in following on that, and the same thing about the water, I'm just not sure from what you've submitted today and in your written submission, what in particular you're asking for, because the FDS is silent in terms of anything to do with the dams or the Soys Bay treatment plants, and there's no talk about, changing the supply there. So I'm just not sure exactly what you're asking for.
We have been told in the not too distant past that council are looking at decommissioning Soys Bay and supplying water from town. If you drive to port at the moment, there are these little black squares on the road, which are quite, and I asked Wakakotahi, what are those squares on the road? And he said, we're testing the ability of the road to contain a water main. So they're obviously doing preparatory work to actually look at having water being brought from town into port. And that's fine as long as you can actually guarantee the future of that resource in terms of the security of the road. I mean, we run along the side of the harbour. This is what we've heard, that they're going to look at decommissioning them because the regulations have changed for dams, storage dams, and that, Cedar Creek and Sawyers Bay may be at risk of being decommissioned.
Thank you. I'll leave that to Jim. Will follow up. He knows more about that than I do. And in your comment about Osborne Road and Long Beach, there's a general comment in the FDS about resilience and access during flood and storm events, but you want something more than a general comment. Is that what you're asking for some specifics put in?
I guess the thing is that the submission is always sort of crystal ball gazing in the sense of what we'd really like, and but I think the thing is that the likes of Osborne Road particularly, it might be a small community, but the reality is that there are times when it's really hard to get in and out of there, and that's something that needs to be looked at, because the Purakanui Inlet is tidal, and as water gets higher, potentially, that could be a real problem for that road. And so it's something that actually needs to be addressed in the shorter term, I think, rather than just being a long-term goal. The people that live there would really like it improved.
Kia ora, Ange. Having attended a lot of cruise ship briefings and debriefings, I'm aware that for a long time it's been an area of contention between moving cruise ship passengers and regular community commuters to the city, with conflicts on your transport network being predominantly buses in more recent times. In a former life, I worked for NZ Rail and used to man the commuter trains. I used to go out to Tairi and to Port Chalmers, and they managed to do those every morning, and they managed to do them every night for the school run and the after work run. And in more recent times, I've heard at those cruise ship briefings that they're not able to run the train service because the priority is freight. And just trying to work out, because the strategy here has to be able to meet those infrastructure needs and balance off difference between commercial retail and your commuter travellers. And on a 2 or 3 cruise ship day, there might be 5,000 people trying to get to town and a few hundred locals, and you have direct issues there that I'm not sure have clearly come through in your submissions. But just want to get an understanding if there was a regular rail service able to happen, and there's a little qualifier in there that there might be an inland port, which will take a lot of the trucks off the road, but it'll mean there'll need to be more shunting happening from town to Port Chalmers, which will put more pressure on the rail line. How important is it for that commuting to be rail or for it to be road?
I think a lot of people would actually really like to see cruise ship passengers going to town by rail. It's something that comes up all the time, and I remember a couple of years ago they had leased the little Silver Fern or whatever it was called, and it would go up the coast to Waitati and back and do the scenic trip. But the fact is that something like that would have been absolutely ideal to transport people into town and back again. I live just above the Whitcliffe Terrace crossing, and an awful lot of money's been spent there, but we're actually still waiting for our barrier arms. It's actually really busy at night and less so during the day. So I don't understand why rail isn't more of an option. And I know Port Otago are looking to, put more on rail. I know many years ago when Mount Allen was coming into logging, we almost had the logs coming out to Mosgiel and being put on the train. But unfortunately the Road Transport Forum squashed that. And so, there's been a lot of wear and tear on our roads since then, and there is every day with logging trucks, container trucks, buses, people. So ideally, rail would actually be a really effective and probably more environmentally friendly way of moving a lot of people in a short distance into town. And I think a lot of people would actually really like that, because I know the Taieri Gorge was very, very popular. It used to come down to the ship, pick up the people who'd booked there, then go to town and pick up the public that had booked. And, people were fighting to get on a bus if they didn't have a booking for a tour to go to town by rail. So ideally that would be great. I mean, rail is, technology's moving on, and rail is actually a really good way to shift a lot of people, short distances or long distances, so it would be great. I mean, I would be in favour of doing that. I remember the kids that used to come from Port on the train going to school, and I didn't live down there, but they always got called the Port kids, and it was a great way to get them all into town. So I think it's something that needs to be seriously investigated, especially for cruise ship people, or better buses.
Conscious we're getting way out of time. When you worked on the trains, it was double railed out to Mosgiel, and it was passing loops out to Port Chalmers, and they've all been lifted up in the meantime. And Kiwi Rail informed NZTA at the time that when the cycleway gets built, there'll be an opportunity to double rail again out to Port Chalmers. So at the moment, commuter rail to Port Chalmers is technically not able to be delivered. To the point on the water treatment plant, the Port Chalmers plant is being decommissioned because it can't achieve 3 barriers, so it's nowhere near close enough to being able to be compliant to Te Mata Arawai. And so I believe what's happening is extra supplies coming out with a larger pipeline off to Mount Grand. In terms of resilience to communities, it's the same resilience that we offer every other community in the town on that system. Usually it takes about 2 to 3 hours to fix a main pipeline break if it does occur. Wasn't any questions really, but I feel there's some.
Well, I think the road is our issue in terms of possible breaks or, in the road if the pipe's running through there.
Kind of a thing occurs, it's usually fixed in 2 to 3 hours.
The gaping hole at Ravensbourne that I came across one day wasn't fixed in 2 to 3 hours. It took several weeks.
The water pipe, not the road.
If the pipe was running through there, it would be affected by a gap like that.
All right, Kate, any questions?
I do have a question, and it's relating to your suggestion about the cruise ships being able to have a different generation, basically, rather than coal power. I think you suggested in on page 148, the comment about additional infrastructure, and this is one that we've heard from Port Otago, is that they can't offer an alternative at the moment because of the lack of power to Port.
Yes.
And I just want, sorry, I'm just turning my mic on. I finished the question. Are you aware of that as a concern, and have you got any suggestions? In here it says telecommunications, electricity and health service providers have not identified any other infrastructure needed to support expected growth in this area. Are you saying that there may, I mean, if that is an issue, is that something that needs to be changed?
I think so. It's a very popular area. People are coming, moving down there regularly. Yeah, I think the reservoir is obviously small, and that is a problem. But
sorry, I'm talking about the electricity. In order to, what you said is that you need to, I was talking about the cruise ships. Sorry, and yeah.
Sorry, Port Otago have said that they can't obviously do cold ironing. It's not something that exists in parts of New Zealand at this point. But also, you would need Manapori to probably provide excess energy if Tiwai Point closes. It might be possible.
All right, thanks very much. I think that's the end of our questions. Thanks very much for coming in and presenting to us and answering those questions, though. Thank you. So our next submitter is Andy Barrett, and I may pronounce this incorrectly, the Waikoati Coast Community Board. Yes, good morning and welcome. So thanks very much for coming in. I've said this to all submitters. I'm not sure who's been listening and who hasn't, but we've read the original submissions. Thank you very much for that. You don't need to read those out to us, but you're very welcome to highlight any key points with a particular focus on any further amendments to the draft FDS that you'd like us to consider.
Thanks very much. I've prepared a written submission that I'm going to read now in the interest of time. And if it would help the staff, I can leave it behind so that you've got it for reference. So good morning. My name's Andy Barrett. I'm Deputy Chair of the Waikoati Coast Community Board, and in the absence of our Board Chair, I'll speak to the Board's submission on the future development strategy. And I thank you for providing the opportunity. I'll begin by restating the key points in our submission, and after that, I'll provide our response to the officer's recommendations. So 2 key points to begin with. It's the board's view that as it stands, this is not really a future development strategy. We would describe it rather as a preliminary audit, focusing on the provision of sites for houses and business in the immediate future and obviously taking account of infrastructure capability. But that said, it's a very useful starting point, and we're pleased to see this strategy being advanced. Regarding our board area, which like you will call the North Coast for convenience, the strategy simply acknowledges the many significant issues we have known about for years without offering a long-term vision for the future. And I'll return to this point at the end. So I'll now talk about the officer's recommendations, and I'll take these in the order which was followed in our original submission. So first of all, transport, public transport. Like other community boards serving our remote communities, our board has campaigned for years to get improvements to the provision of public transport services. And although we've achieved some notable gains of late, and we thank the Regional Council for that, the job is by no means done. The board will continue to seek both to increase frequencies and to extend the range of public transport provision. And I stress that latter point because we note the comment on page 55 that the economics of public transport prioritise fares and frequencies over extending services to rural areas. And please note that this fails to consider the concerns of mana whenua, on page 32 over, quote, historic failure to support mana whenua in their intentions for their native reserves. And these, excuse me, sticky fingers, these intentions that mana whenua refer to include the restoration of a public transport service along Coast Road, a service sadly long lost. Cycling, and I will say here that there has been no collusion between us and one of the previous speakers, but some of this might sound somewhat familiar. The board has expressed strong support for the coastal communities cycle connection, which will eventually link the communities of Waikouaiti, Karitani, Warrington, Evansdale and Waitati with Port Chalmers, from where it would provide a link to the new harbour cycleway. Whilst we acknowledge that this will be a long-term project, we must point out that the community is already set to work on getting part of the track built from Waitati to Orokonui. We must challenge the statement on pages 147 to 148 that this is a tourism route and not a commuter route. Although the cycleway would certainly be attractive to visitors as an opportunity for healthy recreation, its primary purpose is to provide a safe connection between settlements, as its name suggests. And we repeat here our very serious concerns about the physical safety of cyclists and pedestrians on the two sections of State Highway 1, which are identified in our submission. We will, in any case, look forward to reading the promised Otipoti Dunedin Pathways plan. Natural hazards. The North Coast is exposed to a number of natural hazards, most notably flood events. We expect these hazards to increase as time goes on, and we remind the panel of our support for Strategic Direction 4.4 and the commitment to further investigation of natural hazards. The call by mana whenua on page 68 for consideration of coastal and estuarine impacts and outcomes is totally consistent with the board's position. Housing capacity. The board is concerned that the analysis of housing capacity is very much a desktop exercise. We stand by the comments in section 5 of our submission and will return to some further observations when we turn to infrastructure. Otherwise, we simply draw attention to the comment on page 31 that lifestyle developments lie outside the scope and purpose of this document. In response, we would say that a comprehensive future development strategy for the North Coast would have to include lifestyle blocks. Infrastructure. The provision of infrastructure, especially Three Waters, has been discussed and debated in our communities for decades, and I'm sure Andrew Noon will confirm that point. And the board has raised the issue on countless occasions. As it stands, the strategy does no more than identify the problems which are significant both logistically and financially. The comments, such as they are, push any decisions out into the future while providing some ballpark estimates of cost of uncertain origin. It's the board's view that our communities deserve greater clarity about the DCC's future intentions for services that have been an ongoing concern. Are we to have a reticulated sewage treatment plant to service Waitati or not? When are mana whenua and wider community concerns about the future of the Warrington and Waikouaiti facilities going to be addressed? We welcome the news on page 138 that a more thorough investigation of the Three Waters requirements of the North Coast is currently in progress. In the immediate term, we draw attention to the comment on page 138 on the need to address capacity constraints to the supply of potable water from Mount Grand to Waitati and Warrington. The response, which says that these constraints have been identified, does not inspire confidence. We need to know more. In other words, we stand by the statements in 6.4 of our submission. Put simply, there doesn't seem to be evidence that the current provision of potable water can support the potential number of new houses in Blueskin Bay. Green and blue networks, we've no further comments to make other than to say that the request from Mana Whenua on pages 67 and 68 to recognise the importance of conserving marine species is consistent with the board's position. Last page, you'll be pleased to hear. Waste management, we're very happy to see that our request for the inclusion of waste management in the next future development strategy has been accepted, page 151. So to conclude, our submission contained a request for the North Coast to be the subject of a separate and integrated future development strategy. The actual and potential future natural hazards, together with quite enormous infrastructure demands that lie ahead, mean that now is the time to give these the sort of attention that is being given currently to South Dunedin. Note that our request currently before the DCC for a comprehensive management plan for the Waikuiti River and Estuary system would form part of such a strategy. And in fact, I would just note that some of the other things mentioned in the report could also be included in a much more comprehensive report. A central question for such a strategy will be a consideration of the future of Waikuiti itself. Over recent years, there have been calls in the community for the settlement to be identified as a growth centre. The office's recommendations reject this possibility on the grounds, and I quote, that Waikuiti is unlikely to support a well-functioning urban environment due to the distance from the main urban area, meaning poor accessibility and consequent transport-related carbon emissions. I submit that this is a very poor argument. If Waikuiti was to become a significantly larger settlement, there would be a wider range of services available to the local community, meaning that their needs could be met without constant recourse to the central city. And as for the carbon emissions, these must certainly decrease anyway as we move away from reliance on the internal combustion engine. This is to say then that a proper consideration of this issue should remain on the table when the North Coast gets its own future development strategy as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you for that. See if we have any questions for you, Kate.
Look, on that final point, it's quite interesting, and appreciate Palmerston is closer to Macrae's mine, but there are actually private bus services already taking people, I think, from Waikuiti and Palmerston to work elsewhere. Is that correct? Or
yeah, in fact, there are buses that come all the way from Dunedin. So, yes, they run quite regularly and they pick up workers in Waikuiti and other places en route, I think, some from Waitati even, I think, yeah.
Are there any other large industries, and I'm thinking chickens actually, or any other ones that work like ride sharing or private transport systems in Waikuiti currently?
I don't think the chicken operation does, no. No, it's only Macrae's that has its own buses. Yeah.
Speaking of chicken and egg, the staff does say that carbon there'll be carbon impacts of higher commuting out of Waikuiti into Dunedin. Of course, that would be offset if there was better public transport, would there not be? And I guess I am raising this chicken and egg situation because if there's a desire to make sure you have efficient transport systems and therefore not build up distant neighbourhoods too large, if that's not coupled with some approach to public transport, then that basically means that if you're trying to achieve that objective, you will not be able to achieve growth.
Yeah, I could answer that in a bit of a roundabout way. I mean, it is chicken and egg. If the settlement was larger, the demand will be greater, and the provision of public transport would be an essential part of that whole thing. But I think what I'm talking about here, I mean, I look at Christchurch as an interesting example of the way future development has taken place. We've got a perfect example of it. Central City, obviously massively affected as a result of the earthquakes, rebuilding of the Central City. But what has happened there, not just rebuild of the Central City, but actually big development of those satellites around the city, so that you actually have what we might call a medium-sized city with decent-sized satellites around. And I believe that Dunedin could become the same. We've actually got the Central City, we have Mosgiel, we have Port Chalmers, and I believe that that Waikoiti could be the same. And if we're actually thinking truly long-term and integrated, we've got to start looking at where might be the sorts of places where there is capacity to not only accommodate future growth, but also to allow for shifting of housing from areas which are not sustainable to areas that might well be. And the other part of that is, and I'm still concerned about it, even though it's dismissed in the officer's recommendations, that the scale of infrastructure development that is going to be needed for shifting major plants is absolutely massive, and that would make a great deal more sense were there to be a consideration of Waikoiti becoming actually a larger settlement. That's dismissed by the officer's recommendations, but I'm actually worried that when the time comes to, say, shift the Waikoiti waste treatment plant, the actual cost of doing that is going to make it a more difficult decision for the DCC.
Kia ora. In regard to planning detailed design for blue-green networks, there could be any infrastructure in the board catchment, what would engagement look like for your board?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question.
I can probably clarify it. In your submission, you wanted to ensure that the board was engaged with well in designing your blue-green networks?
Not sure that's the board's intention. I mean, the board's view is that the North Coast actually has significant work going on already with regard to conservation. That's with the work of the River Care Group, Waikoiti and Karitani, and also the Lagoon Committee in Waikoiti. We've got quite considerable wildlife going on out there. You can go bird watching, particularly around the Karitani estuary and also at the Hawkesbury Lagoon. There's been a fair bit of work done through the Halo project at restoration of native trees, native plantings and so on. And the main thing for us in the North Coast area, really, with regard to blue-green networks, is the presence and the growing development of the Orokonui Eco Sanctuary. So quite a lot of the work that's been going on out our way has been done through the Halo project, which currently the planting has gone into abeyance because of lack of funding. So the board's position would be that we really support and encourage these things, but I don't think that the board has got any particular role in design or anything like that. I don't know whether that answers your question entirely, but that's actually how I see things. I mean, one of the things that we are concerned about as a board is that the attractions of the North Coast for visitors, a lot of those to do with the natural environment have been underestimated, I think, and so we're very keen to promote more visitors coming to enjoy that side of things. So anything that local community groups are doing to improve blue-green networks, we are fully supportive of.
Thank you. I was interested in your comment that you thought that the FTS was lacking in relation to lifestyle blocks. and generally speaking, lifestyle blocks are pretty self-sufficient in terms of their drinking water and their wastewater. And the FDS is really looking at infrastructure, that would service any urban areas. So, and bearing in mind also, obviously, high productive land in terms of any lifestyle blocks. So I'm just not sure why you think there should be, a section on lifestyle blocks in particular.
Well, one of the reasons why I mention that is that, and one of the reasons why I think that the future development strategy is somewhat narrow in its focus, is that I think there are a lot of other things to do with lifestyle block provision that have to do with things other than simply infrastructure. There are social and environmental issues to do with that, but there's also the other issue is that lifestyle blocks will add to population size and so on, potentially add to vibrancy of communities and so on. So that's why my view would clearly be that a future development strategy needs to be considering more things than the rather narrow focus that it does. I think that the social side of things is one area which is not really considered here. And I'd have to say that's not a criticism. I mean, it's just simply an acceptance that in the introduction to the strategy itself, it says that that is actually what you were asked to do. So that's why it is. Yeah.
I'm less mobile than I used to be, Andy, sorry. Couple of questions. It's a question and a comment, but the question is, when you talk about enhanced services for the North Coast, the narrative that's coming out of the coalition to secure, the 51% subsidy from NZTA is very much around productivity, economic impact in terms of basically growing the economy. Is there anything that you can cast your mind to in and around the North Coast where that sort of language could be added into trying to secure that 51% subsidy support for an enhanced passenger transport service to the North Coast?
Sorry that old age is affecting you badly. Haven't noticed it myself. Off the top of my head, no, I can't. And again, I think rather as Jim says, it's very much chicken and egg type of stuff. At the moment, in the community, we've got obviously the egg production facility in Waikoiti, and we've got the gold mining operation. Other than that, we've got, as you well know, a number of small businesses, but nothing of any real scale otherwise. But my sense would be that actually if you had a larger community there, that would actually generate more in the way of business activity, as it has on the outskirts of Christchurch, for example, as well. So no, I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
Sorry, cut you off. So that leads into my comment. With regards to the Northern Water Scheme pipeline, what I can recall at the time, and I was chair of infrastructure services at the time, that the capacity of the pipe was essentially meeting the needs of existing residentially zoned areas on the districts of the North Coast, plus a margin for expansion. That's what I can recall. So picking up on your point about the potential expansion or whatever, I believe there is a certain level of capacity. I can't remember how much, but there was certainly built into the...
I can comment on this. I'm sure Councillor O'Malley could probably say more. My understanding is that way back when the big pipe, as it's called, was put in, there was the thought at that time of actually extending the big pipe as far as Waikoiti. In the end, the decision was made to take it to Waitati with that capacity for further provision. And of course, one of the things that I didn't mention here with regard to water is water supply to Waikawaiti, and quite clearly, if Waikawaiti was to become a bigger settlement, we would have to look carefully at the provision of drinking water. The cost of that would be very large indeed, because my understanding is that it's not just a matter of tacking something on to the end of the pipe as it exists, but it would have to be a bigger pipe altogether, which runs all the way, which is why I'm really calling for a future development strategy that actually just puts all of these options on the table and actually does a proper assessment of them. Because it might well be in the end that any sort of a review reaches the decision that no, it's not possible for it. We're just simply asking for that to be considered as a possibility. Regarding Waitati Warrington itself, there is anecdotal evidence now that there are problems with water supply from the Mount Grande supply. There are a number of new houses have gone in, quite a large number of new houses have gone into Warrington. We have extra demand from Freedom campers at Warrington Beach. There has also been a new camping ground put in Warrington itself. So it's actually mentioned in the recommendations here that is noted, but as I say, the response there really is they just simply identified the constraints, which doesn't tell us anything really in terms of whether those constraints can actually be dealt with. So that's one of the reasons why we say, well, don't just imagine that you can put in another 110 houses in Waitati and supply them with water, because that simply might not be the case.
Well, thank you, Mr. Barrett. No further questions from me, but thank you very much for. Do we have another question? Do we?
It's the timing of the potable water for Waikawaiti, Karatani, and Warrington being in the 10 to 30 years. I think is probably still in the appropriate time frame. But the pipe going over Lee Saddle is only 150 millimetres, so it is not going to be capable of addressing this. So that's why it's in the 10 to 30, because if it is to come from Mount Grande, it will require a new pipe to be laid, and of course the Waikawaiti River is already unable to supply at the height of the summer. So that's why it's sitting out there.
You note the amount of family concerns as well. Yeah.
All right, thanks very much for that. Another one?
Yeah, sorry. Just I think we asked the coastal communities to give us a breakdown of the priority and the order for the priority for the cycleway, and I'm just wondering if the community board should be participating in that as well, considering they've listed it as one of their issues as well, or give a different view on it, what the priority would be.
I don't think the board would have a view on that. I think that we've got a good group of people. They are very well advised, very well supported. They've got an excellent feasibility study in place, and we would simply leave it to them. We would just simply support them and say sooner the better.
All right, thank you for clarifying that, and thank you very much for coming in. So the next submitter, Paul Southworth. Yep, come on up.
Let's read it's on. When anybody else turns their mic on, it'll turn yours off. So you just to answer, you just need to press again. Unfair.
Thank you.
So good morning and welcome, and thank you for your patience. Sorry, apologies that we're running over time, but thank you for your submission, which you've read. You don't need to read that out to us, but you're very welcome to speak to that and highlight key points for us that you'd like us to bear in mind.
All right. I'm Ron Adams and I live up in Walkery, and we've been there for...
Sorry, just pause for a minute. So we're just a little bit of confusion. We thought you were another submitter. So Mr. Paul South, was he going to come in Zooming or in person? Not in person. So not here. All right. So Mr. Adams, sorry, I got your name wrong. But again, good morning and welcome, and thank you. Proceed.
Thank you. So I live at Walkery and we've been up there for just 30 years, which compares quite differently with some of you people who've been around a long time. The part of Walkery which includes our property at 37 Greenhill Ave has been identified in the draft FDS as a potential future residential intensification zone for transition to medium density housing over a 10 to 30 year time frame. So that's transitional long-term intensification on figure 25 in section 6, 5.1. My submission opposes further suburban medium density residential housing intensification in the Walkery zone and outside the urban areas within the city boundary, even given a 10 to 30 year lead-in time. The plan for intensification is an easy way for council to generate more rates, of course, from the same land area. It's also an invite for developers to buy up multiple properties to build townhouses and apartments. Provision for intensification through subdivision already exists in the suburban areas. There are many considerations for my opposing medium density housing intensification. I'll just quickly list a few. Increased noise from more neighbours, their machinery and traffic. Not just obstruction, but obliteration of existing views. Reduction of privacy. Roading capacity, especially where traffic concentrates at points of access to the city. And shading of living areas and gardens. Now, my submission focuses on just the last two considerations I mentioned then, and particularly the last one, the shading, which concerns potential shading causing reduction in the quality of life for existing residents under the proposed intensification. I begin, therefore, by asking you to consider the following assumptions, two assumptions I'm making really. The first one is that people tend to choose where they live for the quality of life the suburb offers, such as living near parents, kindergarten, primary and intermediate schooling, which we have in Walkery, the range of community activities, range of nearby shopping options, aspect to the sun and so on. Second is change is part of life, but change that potentially reduces the quality of life for residents in different suburban parts of the city is a bad outcome. So those are two assumptions behind what my submission is about. So my first consideration is about the roading. I'd like to leave that, if I may, just and go on to the second one, which is shading, because I'd like your feedback on that. And I'm asking questions as much as I'm making a statement. So my second more important consideration is the shading effects of townhouse and apartment development in the present suburban setting. If anything, I favour a tightening up of building regulations that I acknowledge already do take into account some effects of shading due to dwelling height and distance from the boundary. However, to my knowledge, the existing regulations and the medium density intensification proposal that's in the FDS, as far as I'm aware, don't take into account shading due to the length of a dwelling's roofline and the effect of Dunedin's higher latitude in New Zealand, not to mention the low sunshine hours that we experience in this town. And I say that, as I say, having lived here for 30 years and liked the place. We lived for 18 years in Whakatane before we came here. And there's quite a difference in terms of latitude and sunshine hours. In these enlightened days, we as a society take pride in having recognised that warm, dry homes produce healthier residents with an increased sense of well-being. Long roof-lined townhouse and apartment development on small sections will seriously lessen the ability of direct sunlight warming existing homes. The sun's heat is far more efficient at warming and drying rooms than heat pump, as we discover when the cloud lifts. The amount of indirect lighting would be reduced as well, as is noticed in retrospect when a large tree is felled. All of a sudden, everything seems much lighter. Such shading conditions would create damper, darker, colder and more oppressive environment for existing residents, reducing their quality of life considerably. New residents, of course, choose to live in conditions that exist when they buy. That Dunedin is halfway to the South Pole does not usually score the city brownie points. But the low-angle midday winter solstice sun and the low sunshine hours, which are about 1,500 compared with Whakatane's 2,200, should be a consideration in building regulations. And I'm making that statement as much as I'm asking the question whether they are in fact. You hopefully can help me out on that. The winter solstice angle in Dunedin is a mere 21.5 degrees. That's pretty low. And that's calculated by subtracting the Earth's tilt, which is 23.5 degrees these days, from our 45 degree latitude. That gives us 21.5 degree midwinter sun angle. This winter solstice angle is considerably less on steeper southeast facing parts of the proposed Walkery zone. And I note on that map that I referred to, it seems to be bounded by Greenhill Ave and Nairn Street at the bottom. So it's covering a downhill south facing aspect. That low angle of winter sun, when the sun is obstructed by intensification of buildings, would result in a lot more shading of existing properties, and so much reduced quality of life. I'll give you an example. A friend who lived in Evans Street in Opaho, where the midwinter sun hits the ground at near right angles, experienced a much higher daytime outside air temperature than we did, I'm assuming, in Walkery. We just got on the phone and compared our outdoor temperatures. We're situated at the top of this zone, as far as I can work out from the map. We're just below the ridgeline, so our property doesn't slope steeply away to the south. It's pretty much on a level up the top there. But there was a huge, I can't remember the figure, but it was 8 or 10 degrees difference in air temperature just because of the difference in slope. So housing intensification would further reduce the light and warmth that we do get. So just in summary, I oppose the FDS suburban housing intensification proposal in hilly, higher latitude Walkery and suburban residential Dunedin, and would even like to see a more nuanced tightening of existing building regulations to take into account the constraints of latitude, local topography, and low sunshine hours on shading in suburban neighbourhoods. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Adams. I think your views have been put forward very clearly in terms of your opposition to medium density and the standards that go with it, and particularly in relation to the area that you're concerned about, which is proposed future area number 6 in the FDS. So I'm not sure if we'll have any questions for you, given the clarity of your presentation to us, but I'll just check. Andrew?
I have thought of one. The reliance of the sun, in your view, is it, and I appreciate from a Dunedin resident's perspective, if you are looking for a desirable site, if you're a prospective purchaser of a property, residential property, looking for a desirable site, your probably number one attribute would be which way it faces to the sun. And how much sun you get on the property, etc. But my question is around building techniques, insulation methods, heating methods. Do you think we are still reliant on the sun like we were when, even back over the years, when those techniques weren't available and weren't as effective?
No, you're right. And many people choose to live in areas where the sun isn't of importance to them, and they heat their homes differently. What I'm suggesting is that there are many people in the suburbs who do rely on the sun for heating and for their well-being and quality of life. So there are parts of the city which people are quite happy to live in that don't rely on the sun and the sun's angle. And I accept that, but I think that people like myself do look for a place that's got a good aspect. That's not a dumb idea. For example, when we first came down here, we lived in Ravensbourne, and for 5 days I jogged to the top of the hill there and looked out early in the morning and noticed that there was 5 parts of town that had the early morning sun, and went up again in the evening, did the same thing, and the same 5 places, interestingly, which all happened to be State House areas. We have had a little maxim over the years that we always try and buy a house with the back of the house facing the sun rather than the front, so that you can actually live and enjoy that part of your home. So yes, sun is important for some people and it's not important for others. So having housing intensification in the areas where it does tend to be more important for people seems like a dumb idea to me.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr. Adams. And you said in your submission that the 2 main issues was roading and shading, which you've talked a lot about shading, and you mentioned in your actual written submission about roading. Now, I know the area well. My children went to Balmacewen Intermediate, so I understand the issues in terms of, I guess, congestion with cars parking on it. So there's nothing further that you want to, apart from what you've written here in your submission, that it's just the fact that the roads are already, the streets are already quite congested with parking, no matter what time of the day or night you travel on them. Thank you. Turn your mic on.
Sorry. If I was to say any more, it would be that there are many ways of mitigating those problems, but they are problems that would need to be addressed infrastructure-wise, and the streets I've mentioned that we access the city from are extremely narrow. Even with just parking on one side, and parking on two sides, there's no room for opposing traffic at all. So it's, apart from the fact that increased traffic is decreasing quality of life, which is where I came at this whole exercise from.
Mr. Adams, thanks very much for coming in and answering the question that we did have, and thanks for your clear presentation.
Okay. Thanks for listening in and participating.
All right, so that brings us to the end of today's submitters. We were due to hear from Mr. Paul Southworth from the Aroha Kaikorai Valley Trust, but hasn't come in, so we haven't heard from him. So, okay, we'll assume he's not coming in, so that leads us to the end of the day. So just before we wrap up, just to remind panel members that we reconvene at 1 o'clock on Monday, so don't come in at 9 o'clock because we won't be there. We'll be here at 1 o'clock. Now, the officers would like to know from the panel members which technical experts / advisors the panel would like to have available next week. Clearly, transport is required. So if we just do a quick rip around, any other technical experts from the council teams that you'd like to have present, Andrew?
Well, someone perhaps who could give us a little bit more information around what the Disability Action Group raised, John Marable raised as well, and also Mary O'Brien, just understanding what it would take to scope out a universal design approach. So it's sort of a building aspect.
Yeah, and I guess relevant to that is what does the district plan already require in terms of accessible or access in terms of disabled people, in terms of whatever standards it currently has in it. I imagine it would have some, most district plans do. So.
I'm not sure whether it'll be answered in the response to our questions, but in terms of Three Waters, we've talked about like infrastructure restraints with the new hospital building, things like that. Whether we actually need to have somebody here to answer further questions once we've seen our written response.
All right. So Emma, I imagine you're getting some advice from Three Waters staff. So and you'll present that in your end of hearing report. So if they could be present during that, that would be great.
Might need Three Waters stormwater management for the Southern Hub, Edge Hub presentation.
Does that include, do you mean also ORC?
Oh, our part of the stormwater part of it. Yep. Well, you'll need your ones. I know, what I mean is our ones can't speak for your part of it, so we'll need it till it gets to your part, and then you'll need someone from when it from that point on.
Committee, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Other than that, I'm thinking.
Well, I think we're going to have the whole mix here. I'm not quite sure how ORC are going to respond to those suggestions of they've been asked a number of times about the flood banks. It was interesting to get your comments about how they're utilised in the Napier area, but whether that's going to be engineering discussing that or a written response, whichever. Yeah.
Yes, I'm not sure what you call them in the ORC, but the flood / drainage infrastructure engineer, manager, whoever is responsible for that. They're all different titles around the countryside. Not necessarily, because what I imagine happening is that the end of hearing report will respond to the issues that the panel have raised during the hearing, or that have been raised by submitters that the staff wish to address us on, even if we haven't asked direct questions. So my understanding is there'll be a written end of hearing report that'll be informed by appropriate council technical experts. If an appropriate technical expert has informed your planning advice to us or policy advice to us, it might pay to have that expert present on that Wednesday afternoon at least, in case we wish to delve into these technical matters a little bit further. So we don't necessarily need them here on Monday afternoon and Tuesday, because any technical issues we raise, I imagine, would be responded to by the experts in terms of the feedback they give to the authors of the end of hearing report, rather than answering questions directly, because that hasn't happened this week. Yeah. Emma, is that how you saw it working? Yeah. Okay. So just one further matter. So the issue of the interplay between the Otago RPS and the FDS has been raised by you, Kate. So Patricia has obtained a legal opinion on that, which will be dropped into a memorandum and circulated to us and posted on the web page. But I've read that email, and the bottom line is really there's only one sentence in there that's important. It says, making decisions on the FDS is not informed by the PORPS provisions. It goes the other way. So that's all we need to know about that. But that'll be put into a memo. It goes into a little bit more detail, and that'll be available to us and to submitters. All right, so before we finish, anything else any panel member wishes to raise at this stage? Oh. Yep.
Just a reminder of the question yesterday. Is there any questions for the submitters next week that can be, well, probably the staff, in relation to the submitters from next week that can be anticipated, just to give them a head start on, given the short time frame they have?
Okay, so if you were going, in terms of next week's submitters, your reading of their submissions had led you to think you might be directing a question to the officers along the lines that we've done the last few days. If you have anything in mind, if that could be put on the table now to assist the staff.
I don't know in terms of the, let's call it the freight hub on Monday afternoon, and in terms of, and I don't know whether that, how it links with the FDS in terms of the announcement yesterday in terms of the fast track legislation and the calling for submissions by May 2, and whether how that impacts with the FDS. If for example, they come on Monday and say that they're going to be putting an application in on that, how that, whether there's a interface with the FDS, I'm not sure, because there's obviously a timing issue.
Yeah, I imagine if there's a timing issue in terms of the legislation going through the House and being enacted, then there's a timing issue if it is a fast track project that's in the legislation, how quickly it's referred to an expert panel for the setting of conditions and whether or not the ministers then approve it.
Exactly.
I mean, if it goes down that fast track and it's approved, it's a done deal.
I know.
Regardless of what
regardless of what we
says.
say.
Yep.
Yeah. So that was all I'm thinking of. Yeah.
Yep. I mean, Hawani and I have been involved in fast track applications, and they do go fast. And once the decision's made, they're a done deal.
And especially if they're listed, and we're not determining it, we're just putting in conditions.
Yeah. And pretty
So it's irrelevant whether it's in the FDS or not. Thank you. That would be my would have been my question for next week.
No, I think the transport question we asked yesterday is probably the only one that.
Just one other matter to raise. I know with speaking to staff, some of the subject matter is possibly straying outside scope of FDS at times, and just highlighting that that staff may advise on that, because really sort of planning provisions, and we're starting to get into some of the discussion around the plans, rules, and framework are probably I mean, it's not a hard and fast line with an FDS, but possibly straying outside that grey line of what is in the FDS or not, and just being mindful of what you're asking staff to do and the time they have available to try to keep it focused on what's inside the FDS in terms of scope.
Yep.